So thank you very much, Isidore. I'll just, as people kind of come back from getting their coffee and stuff like that, I just want to express my own thanks for being invited to Isidore and also to Howard to inviting me to speak. I'm actually originally from Edmonton. I lived there most of my life. I also lived in Whitehorse and lived a couple of years just outside of Kamloops. So it always feels like I'm coming home when I come out west. And so I really want to express my sincere thanks and appreciation to the Westbank First Nation for opening up their territory and welcoming me back here and acknowledging the unceded territory that we are on right now. I've had the privilege in Western Canada of sharing the territory of a lot of different First Nations and Indigenous communities, and it always feels good to come back home. I guess I have some prepared remarks here, and I'll kind of try and faithfully go through them a little bit, but I probably will divert from them from time to time. I basically wanted to kind of talk about three things, I think, specifically in providing the update from Health Canada on the implementation of the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regulation. So as we know, it's a little over a year since the Act was brought into force, and a lot of developments have taken place. The first thing I wanted to start with was something that Chief McLeod mentioned in his presentation on the Chiefs Committee for Cannabis, is that last week the new government swore in a new cabinet, included a number of different new cabinet ministers. We have a new Minister of Health, Patty Hajdu, and Minister Blair, who folks who have worked on the cannabis file previously are very familiar with Minister Blair. He was made Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. One thing that was kind of not necessarily highlighted in the headlines when the cabinet was announced is that the responsibility for the administration of the Cannabis Act switched ministers. So up until a couple of weeks, or I guess a week ago, my political boss was Minister Blair. He was the minister responsible for the Cannabis Act. But given the switch of roles and responsibilities, that responsibility for the administration of the Act has gone back to the Minister of Health. So it's Minister Hajdu who's actually responsible for the administration. So she is my political boss and is the one who now oversees all of the decisions, regulatory and otherwise, under that Act. So I kind of wanted to mention that it is an honor for me to be up here on stage to share the stage with a lot of leaders like former Chief Day, Chief McLeod, Chief Deere. I'm not a leader. I'm a bureaucrat. I'm a public servant, and I have been that for close to 20 years. And I take that title very seriously and to heart, public servant. So I see my job and the job of my team at Health Canada to really serve the public interest and on behalf of all Canadians. It was circumstance that led me to Ottawa 20 years ago, and it gave me the opportunity to work for the national government and to kind of make that contribution back to my community, the country, as a servant to the people. And so that's the kind of attitude and philosophy that I've always brought to my work and continue to bring to my work on cannabis. So I think that I'll kind of skip ahead here because I do want to leave time for questions from the floor, Isidore, because I think that that's probably the best way to get information out to people that they're really interested in. But I did want to cover a couple of things. The first is that, as folks know, the Act came into force a year ago on October 17th. And really, when the Act first was brought into force, it provided legal access to a limited range of cannabis products, namely dry cannabis, cannabis oil, cannabis plants, and cannabis plant seeds. It was only October 17th, 2019 of this year that amendments were made to the Act and the cannabis regulations underlying them that provided for legal access to a much broader range of cannabis products. And those are edible cannabis, cannabis extracts, including cannabis vaping products, and what we call topical cannabis products. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about those classes of cannabis products, how we're regulating them, and what you can kind of expect to see out of the legal industry over the next couple of weeks. So I'll kind of go to my remarks here. The regulations that were brought into force just this past fall for these classes of new products, it was kind of interesting to hear the panel just before, are really focused on the quality assurance and addressing the unique public health and safety risk posed by these new categories of products. I think Health Canada has tried to draw from lessons learned in other jurisdictions that have moved before us in providing legal access to different cannabis products. And we've looked a lot to US states. And so Colorado is often held up as kind of one of the pioneers in providing regulated access to cannabis. And in our discussions with Colorado officials, they really acknowledged that a lack of regulation around edible cannabis products led to a number of pretty serious challenges in the early days. A lot of unintended health consequences kind of highlighted in the media, and I think most serious were a lot of hospital visits due to overconsumption of edible cannabis or accidental consumption by children. So in response to these challenges, Colorado went about kind of after the fact changing their regulations to try and address some of these concerns. They put in place things like standard serving sizes, limits on the amount of THC that could be in these products, rules for clear labeling and child-resistant packaging. So that's an example of some of the risks that these new products pose, and the regulations that were brought into force this fall kind of include all of those controls, drawing from those lessons learned so that we're not in this reactive state, that when these products actually make it onto market, we already have these controls in place to minimize those risks. So that's just one example. I would say that when we developed the regulations, we kind of considered four primary concerns around these products. The first is that edible cannabis in particular is just inherently more appealing to young people than eating something, whether it's a baked good like a brownie or even a drink that looks like a soft drink, is inherently has more appeal than smoking a joint, particularly to young people. So we want to make sure that we have controls in place to really mitigate and address that risk. The second one is the one I kind of mentioned in the Colorado experience. It's that risk of overconsumption and accidental consumption. So edible cannabis, when you consume cannabis, it affects the body much differently than smoking or inhaling cannabis. It takes much longer to feel the effects. So whereas you inhale cannabis or smoke cannabis, you can feel the effects within seconds to minutes. When you eat cannabis or drink it, it can take several hours before you feel the effect. I'm not a doctor or scientist by any stretch, but I work with a bunch who are really smart and tell me things. One interesting thing that I learned is that when you eat cannabis, what happens is that your body converts the THC in the liver to a more potent form of the drug. And so not only does it take longer to feel that effect, but when you eat it, it has a different effect on the body. And if people have experienced consuming cannabis themselves, they'll know that people describe that feeling as being, like a more of a body stone, or it's a different feeling than inhaling cannabis. So because of the difference in how it affects the body, it's really easy for a naive or new user to eat a little bit and think that I should feel the effect right away. And when they don't, they think, oh, I need to eat more. And so they'll eat a couple more pieces, they'll eat a couple more pieces, and before they know it, they've overconsumed, and that's when they'll lead to an adverse reaction where they feel sick, they feel paranoid, and they're brought to the hospital. So again, we wanted to make sure that we had controls in place to address that risk of overconsumption and of accidental ingestion. So recognizing that some of these products are going to be more appealing and could easily be mistaken for a non-cannabis product, a beverage or a food, that not knowing that it has cannabis in it, that if it's accidentally ingested, we wanted limits on the amount of THC in it so that you could avoid those really adverse reactions. The last risk that we really paid attention to was the risk of contamination, foodborne illness, and of the introduction of harmful ingredients, whether it's ingredients that kind of increase the potential negative health consequences, so things like that would increase the addictive potential of cannabis. Cannabis does have addiction potential, and people do develop problematic use with cannabis consumption. So we wanted to avoid ingredients that would make that worse. So things like adding nicotine or caffeine that we know are also have addictive properties. And we also wanted to avoid the introduction of contaminants that themselves are toxic, that are harmful to health. And I think that, and I'll speak a little bit more to this in a little bit, what is being observed in the United States and a little bit in Canada with the emergence of what is being called severe vaping-associated pulmonary illness, or it's basically people who are vaping are getting sick, and some of them seriously sick. And in the United States, we're seeing a number of deaths attributed to this. And while no kind of definitive cause has been identified yet, there are a number of different strong hypotheses that the illness is being caused by harmful ingredients that are being introduced to the vaping product by people who are manufacturing and producing them illegally and outside the license framework. So these are the key risks that we had in mind when we were developing these regulations. And it kind of reinforces what the panel was talking about just before, about how we need to think that these products are more sophisticated, they are more complex, they include a lot of different ingredients, they include a lot of different product forms. And as a result, we really need to pay very close attention to how they're being manufactured, how they're being produced, under what conditions they're being stored, all of those things to make sure that we are addressing those risks so that the product that ends up on store shelves and available to adult consumers has been controlled to address those, what I call in bureaucratic speak, those known and reasonably foreseeable risks. But I want to underline that as the health regulator, it's my obligation to kind of point out that cannabis consumption carries risks, and so that even with these regulatory controls in place, we can't call these products safe. They're not. They carry risks with them, and so what we've done with these regulatory controls and all the legislative framework is seek to reduce those risks, seek to reduce those harms, and to arm consumers with knowledge so that they can make informed decisions themselves about whether and how they consume cannabis. One other thing I wanted to mention about these new products is one of the regulatory requirements is that if you manufacture them, you have to give Health Canada a 60-day advance notice of your intent to sell them. So the regulations came into force on October 17th. That was the first day that a federally licensed processor could tell Health Canada, here are the products that I plan on selling, the edible cannabis, the cannabis extracts I plan on selling, and they had to provide us with information. And so what that means is that they can't sell them until that 60 days is elapsed. So the earliest we expect to start seeing these products appear through the legal supply chain is mid-December. A lot of provinces and territories, and you will be hearing from some of them later today, have kind of indicated that it's more likely it's going to be in the new year, just as the industry ramps up, produces significant inventory, and kind of fills up the supply chain. But I wanted to share with you what we've kind of observed through these what we call new product notices. So since October 17th, Health Canada has received around 1,500 notices for new products. So it's a big number. We kind of expected that. I should say that's not necessarily 1,500 unique products. The way the requirement is that if you have a different size format or a different flavor or a different THC or CBD profile, it means a new notice. So if you have an apple beverage and an orange beverage and a pineapple beverage, then those are 3 separate notices. But it gives you an indication of how the market is set to see a huge kind of growth in the diversity of products that are available. It won't just be dry cannabis and cannabis oil anymore. Of those roughly 1,500, around 30% are in the edible category. So that's things like beverages and baked goods and kind of candy or confectionery items. Around 60% are in the extracts class. And people kind of ask, what is this extracts class? So people are familiar with cannabis oil, that's an extract. An extract is essentially when you take the raw kind of cannabis plant material, you subject it to, I saw there's a booth out there, people who obviously specialize in extraction, they have their equipment out there. You extract the active kind of compounds out of the cannabis plant. So what the scientists call the cannabinoids, so the THC, the CBD, and you create a distillate, and then you add that, you mix it with other ingredients, you dilute it or whatever to produce a product. So cannabis oil is the one extract that you see in the market now, but what you can expect to see is that, again, to grow quite significantly, to include things like tinctures. So these are things that, little liquids that you would drop under your tongue or in your mouth. It would include things like hashish or even higher potency concentrates that go by the names of like shatter, rosin, or wax. And it also includes those vaping products that I talked about, and that could be in the form of a liquid that is in a kind of a cartridge-based system that comes integrated with an electronic cigarette type of device, where I'm sure you guys have seen them on the street, where you puff on it, and that's how you consume your cannabis. So about 60% of the notices are in that kind of broad extracts class. And then about 5% is in that topical class, and that's really products that are intended to be applied to the hair, your skin, and your nails. So one of the things that we're doing when we look at these new product notices, and it kind of talks to some of the regulatory controls we have in place, and I'll just kind of use the vaping products as an example. So I talked about how we consider those risks in developing the rules, and when it comes to vaping products and extracts in particular, we looked at the potential for those harmful ingredients. And so there are rules around what ingredients can be added to cannabis extracts, including vaping products. Number one is that kind of overarching requirement for all products is that they can't be appealing to kids. Can't be appealing to young people. They can't be designed, manufactured, sold, packaged, labeled in a way that it's obvious that they're targeting young people with these products. They have to be oriented towards the adult use market. There's also a number of prohibited ingredients. I kind of talked about some that could increase the risk of developing dependence on the product, so things like caffeine and nicotine. But we've also prohibited a number of known ingredients that are cause harm to the user. So this is things like if people have been reading about the vaping illness in the United States, one of the culprits potential culprits that the U.S. Center for Disease Control has identified is something called vitamin E acetate. And so that compound is specifically prohibited under the Cannabis Act and its regulations and cannot be added to any cannabis extract, including those intended for vaping. And then there's also a general rule. We often rely on these in law, where we basically say to the industry, you're also responsible for making sure that you're not adding any ingredient, it's not specific, any ingredient that would cause harm to the health of the user when the product is used as intended. So this is a catch-all, and so that would cover things like you can't add anything that is a known carcinogen, that is a known hazard to lung health. And so there was a recent study that looked at a case of a vaping illness in London, Ontario, where the researchers kind of pointed at a substance called diacetyl, which is it's a flavoring agent that is used for flavoring microwave popcorn, believe it or not. When you eat it, it's fine, it doesn't hurt you. But when you inhale it, it causes severe damage to the lungs. And it was first observed in factory workers working in these microwave popcorn factories who were suffering lung damage, and they realized it was a result of them inhaling this chemical diacetyl. So diacetyl would be prohibited under this general catch-all as a chemical that is known to cause a hazard to the health of the user. So all this to say, I won't kind of continue to bore you with like the intricacies of this. But I just kind of want to highlight how thoughtful and comprehensive the regulatory controls that Health Canada has put in place are with respect to these new cannabis products. Equal attention has been given to the edible category, to the topical category, to really make sure that the manufacturers, the licensed processors who make these things, and the stores who sell them know that they've gone through a quality assurance process, that they're being manufactured according to a set of rules that are thoughtful, that are based on the best kind of information out there, and are easily updated and amended and adapted as we learn more about potential risks to human health. And in the vaping world, that's definitely a challenge. There's still a lot we do not know about the long-term consequences of vaping, whether it's vaping cannabis or vaping nicotine. And the framework that we've put in place gives the government the ability to adapt, to add new rules. And the other thing that we have is the scientific expertise and the capacity to go in and make sure that the legal industry is actually following the rules, that they're keeping the records, that they're following the standard operating procedures, that they're actually following the regulations, they're testing the product, we can grab the samples of the product ourselves, send them to our own laboratories to make sure that they are, in fact, following the rules. All right, so that's kind of the new products. The next thing I wanted to talk about was just the work that Health Canada has been doing with Indigenous communities across Canada to kind of better understand the issues, the challenges, the interest that they have in the cannabis industry and the cannabis framework, and making sure that we are looking to apply the framework as it's currently designed in a way that meets those interests, and looking at exploring flexible ways for us to make sure that the application of the framework in those individual communities makes sense for them. So there's a table there with a couple of folks in the Indigenous engagement team who I encourage you to go chat with. You guys should wave. They've been out across Canada visiting a number of different Indigenous communities. We have a booth set up where Roxy, our Indigenous navigator, is. And so I really encourage you, don't just listen to me, talk to them about what we're doing, the resources that we have, and the information, and what we're willing to do to kind of come into communities, meet with the band, meet with the council, and kind of share what we're doing and what's available. So I would say over the past 2 years, Carrie, Jessica, and the team have met with approximately 170 held about 170 different engagement meetings across Canada and in a number of different communities. And we've really heard, and it's kind of been reflected, and I won't go on too much about it, we've really heard a big diversity of opinions, concerns, questions, and it has been reflected this morning. And those range from concerns around the health consequences of the legalization and providing regulated access to cannabis in specific communities, and making sure that communities have the resources and the information and the knowledge at hand to address the kind of realities that they're facing in the community. Chief McLeod talked about that a little bit this morning, about how attitudes are changing. The conversation's changing a little bit, where people are actually willing to kind of openly discuss about whether or not they're using cannabis for a medical purpose, whether or not they're using cannabis for a non-medical purpose. The stigma associated with it is starting to disappear. I spoke at a conference in Ottawa on Monday around substance use in general and the use of all kinds of different drugs. And I was asked kind of what's changed in the last year since the Cannabis Act came into force. And one of the things that I have observed that's changed is the dialogue, the conversation about cannabis in any community in Canada. My observation is that when I first started this job, before the Cannabis Act came into force, you kind of had very polar conversations about legalization, where people felt very, very, very strongly in favor of it, and people who felt very, very, very strongly against it. And I'd say in the last year, that conversation has become more nuanced. It's become more based on actual, rather than beliefs and people's feelings, it is starting to become more evidence-based, more informed. And I think people are starting to understand that this is a complex space, that there are both challenges and opportunities that present themselves through this policy change, and that the dialogue is becoming richer. And so we are trying to encourage that type of informed discussion in Indigenous communities across Canada, but by providing resources, by providing public education material, translating material into different Indigenous languages, by providing funding and support directly to community-based programs that are going in and educating young people, or going in and going into schools, community groups, to make sure that people understand what cannabis is, what it does, that they understand that, as I talked about, eating cannabis is different than inhaling it, and you need to take steps to make sure that you're protecting yourself should you choose to consume cannabis. The other thing that the government is doing is providing those supports to communities to help deal with some of the negative consequences associated with substance use dependence, which is a possibility with cannabis. And so our partners in Indigenous Services Canada and the First Nation Inuit Health Branch have provided and continue to provide resources for treatment and for greater kind of community-based programs that kind of deal not only with kind of after the fact, but kind of deal with addressing risk factors that present themselves early to avoid problems from developing in the first place. So that's kind of on the public health side. And then equally, we've heard, as again we've heard this morning, that there's a big interest in the economic development opportunities that the legal cannabis industry presents. So already, there are a number of Indigenous affiliated companies who are participating in the legal industry. Health Canada has licensed 14 different Indigenous affiliated companies to cultivate or process cannabis. And there are almost 50 additional applicants who are currently in the queue. On top of that, we've licensed almost 25 different Indigenous affiliated growers of industrial hemp, which is another part of the cannabis industry which presents a range of different opportunities. Let's not I'm not going to kind of pretend that the licensing process isn't difficult, that it isn't a challenge. And Health Canada has put resources in place to try and help Indigenous affiliated applicants making its way through the process. So outside at the booth, she's probably there right now, Roxy is our Indigenous navigator. So she's a resource that's available to anyone to kind of sit down and walk through what is involved in obtaining a license from Health Canada, whether it's for cultivating cannabis, whether it's for processing and making those final products, whether it's to get into the research and analytical testing space, into industrial hemp, or to open a nursery or something like that. I know that, and we've heard this, that the financial obstacles, the financial hurdle to enter the legal market is substantial. And we heard that kind of 2 years ago when we were developing the first set of cannabis regulations. And in response, the government put in place the micro class of licenses. Now, I know that there's still a lot of kind of information out there and people talking and saying, you need to hire me because it's going to take you 5 years and $5 million to get like a micro license. It's not true. I want to kind of reinforce that in terms of entry to market, the micro class of license is specifically designed to kind of present a lower burden hurdle to entry. I know there's a woman who's, because everything cannabis related seems to find its way onto social media. There's a woman, I believe she's in BC, who's got a bit of notoriety because she's obtained a micro license. And she kind of, on Reddit, I think it is, she's gone kind of stepwise through how she actually went about doing it, and she did it for less than $50,000. So it is possible. And I really encourage folks who are interested in entering the legal space and coming into Health Canada to get a license, to talk to Roxy and to get really good information on what's involved and how to kind of structure your application to make sure that you know what's expected of you so that you're able to kind of demonstrate that you meet those requirements. And again, I just kind of want to reinforce and make sure that everyone understands those requirements are there really fundamentally for those public health and safety reasons, so that we're able to have that confidence that the cannabis products that ultimately are sold through the legal supply chain are in fact regulated for quality. So that's the production side. That's what Health Canada does. And then there is obviously a lot of opportunity on the retail side. And so later today, there will be a panel with some of my colleagues from Saskatchewan, BC, and Ontario who will talk about what they're doing to make sure that that opportunities to participate in the regulated legal retail side of the cannabis industry are there and present for people. I think that a number of I won't steal their thunder, but there are a number of different recent announcements by provincial governments that are, I think, the expectation, and I think that kind of given what I talked about, that initial kind of polar views around cannabis kind of reflected that early on people took a precautionary approach to the establishment of their frameworks. And as we've developed experience, as time has gone on, we're seeing those frameworks adapt, and evolve, and change. That's certainly true from Health Canada's perspective and how we go about licensing producers, and I think we're observing that on the part of provinces and territories as well. So Ontario government is mused about eliminating its lottery. The Saskatchewan government has announced that they intend to move past the lottery system. The government of New Brunswick has announced a review of their system where they have the retail operated strictly by the provincially owned Crown Corporation to look at how they can open up their system to include a private operator of that system and provide for Indigenous participation in the retail sales in that province. So I think we'll continue to see the system evolve and opportunities present themselves, and to kind of Sherry's point that she made this morning on her panel, that as people recognize that there are barriers in place, largely unintended, that they can be removed, so that fundamentally, I think, in the conversations I've had with Isidore and others, fundamentally we share the same objectives. The federal government really moved to legalize and provide regulated access to cannabis to really improve public health and public safety outcomes for its citizens. And that same interest exists in every single Indigenous community that we've held engagement sessions with. And I think there's a shared recognition that a way to accomplish that is to provide regulated access to regulated cannabis products, that so that we don't end up in kind of the perpetuation of of the problem that existed prior to the Cannabis Act, which is basically people using cannabis and then obtaining it from the illegal black market. So that kind of leads me, I guess, to the last issue, which is the question of jurisdiction and governance. This is a priority that was raised by Chief McLeod this morning. I know Isidore is going to speak to it later today. I think that, I guess, to kind of offer the federal perspective, so the Cannabis Act really is meant to work in concert with kind of applicable laws, regulations, rules, bylaws of different levels of government. It was never meant to be the one law to rule them all, to kind of, I guess, shamelessly quote from Lord of the Rings. It was meant to provide a kind of foundation for a national framework that where you have kind of cannabis products regulated for safety and quality, where you have behavior or activities with cannabis, the possibility for them to be carried out legally under certain conditions, and while other conditions remain kind of criminally prohibited. So, for example, selling to kids or smuggling cannabis out of the country into the United States remain kind of criminal. But within that framework, the intention was for other orders of government and other governments to enact rules, legislation, bylaws that they have the authority to make that would coexist with the Cannabis Act. And I think that, in the dialogue sessions that we've had with different communities, and Chief Deere talked about how we've been working with her community specifically. I like her description of the kind of the I'm not going to get it right, but kind of like walking side by side, that we're kind of respecting each other's interests in governing certain activities with cannabis, and that we can actually benefit from each other's experience, knowledge, and expertise. And so to the extent that Health Canada, as the country's health regulator with experience and scientific capacity in addressing issues of public health and public safety, to the extent that we can bring that to the table to the benefit of every community in this country and work in collaboration with communities and respect what knowledge, understanding that they have around their specific circumstances, I think is the best way that we'll kind of end up with a framework that collectively meets the objectives that we've all set together. So I think I'll leave it there. And maybe I will just kind of invite questions. Yeah, Isidore, I don't want to kind of ramble on too long. I think I have already, so.
So what I'll do is I'll just help guide the questions in.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you, John. And again, John is offering an opportunity for the delegation here to focus in on some of what he's talked about and maybe questions that you have as well. But basically, John spoke about Health Canada's mandate around public health and safety. He gave us a little bit of a rundown on what's transpired in Cannabis 2.0 with the edibles now coming on stream, and what's going to transpire with regards to about 60% of new notices with regards to products and what that's going to mean. He's also talked about the issue of retail and the relationship with the provinces and territories. But he's also talked about the fact that C-45 was not intended to be the law of the supreme law of the land. However, just to open and facilitate discussions and opportunities where other jurisdictions can actually work in lockstep with the enabling legislation C-45. And in fact, that's what we're seeing play out in First Nation communities where First Nations are developing and adopting their own laws, putting the proper policy framework in place, and ultimately working towards the regulatory frameworks that will ensure that the aspirations and the objectives of C-45 are followed. So those are some of the things that he spoke about. The floor is yours. Questions and answers.
Maybe just ask people to go to one of the microphones so that I can spot you and other people can hear you. Okay. So no, thank you for the question. And I think that, I mean, I want to give a thoughtful answer, and it's hard for me. I think I always do this, and I never, I don't mean to kind of beg for sympathy, but it's always hard to speak for the entire federal government. Because I don't necessarily have all the answers that you're looking for. And what I would say is that I'll sincerely endeavor to kind of help answer. I think that one of the things that happened in the last year, so as the federal government, like all of this is new, including for the federal government, right? And for Health Canada. So when I first started working on cannabis 3 years ago, I worked in a team of less than 30 people. And now the kind of cannabis side of Health Canada is several hundred. And one of the things that happened is they reorganized how the department is functioning to include cannabis in the same group as controlled substances and the opioid response team, and so I now work really closely with colleagues who are dealing with the opioid crisis and other forms of substance use and addiction that are quite frankly a public health emergency in this country. And I'm not just saying that. The former Minister of Health used that exact language. I think that, I mean, I could kind of read in my notes here the resources that the federal government has put towards kind of addiction treatment and things like that. And I know you're not interested in hearing that, and you've probably heard people tell you that a million times. I think that what I can say honestly and sincerely is that there is wide recognition that the opioid crisis in Canada needs to be addressed, and the efforts to address it thus far have have failed to make a serious dent in the crisis. I think that it exists across the country and more acutely in certain regions of the country and in certain communities. I think that, and I don't want to speak for the minister, that's really dangerous, but we have a minister of health now who comes from Thunder Bay, and prior to her life as a politician and a cabinet minister, worked in public health, in addiction treatment in Thunder Bay, worked in a homeless shelter, and so really understands from personal experience the challenges that people on the ground actually face in addressing this issue. And so I do think that that she will bring a perspective to this that will hopefully help address the very real issue and concerns that people have.
Well, if you guys ever want to speak to the team at the Waunakee Treatment Center, again, who services all First Nations and Inuit of Canada, give me a call. I'll give you my card later. Miigwech,
Yep.
thank you.
For sure.
John, thank you for your presentation. I'd like to ask you, one of the stated aims of the federal government was to reduce the black market, the illicit market. And they're struggling to do that in the west of Canada because it's so entrenched, it's been here for such a long time. I'd identify one of the drivers for the underground market, particularly for medical access, are the different delivery methods. People have been using edibles and topicals and all these other things that you've mentioned that we're getting 18 years after the advent of the MMAR, 18 years, a year after legalization. I understand why that was done, but what timescale do you think there will be for other delivery methods, such as nasal sprays, suppositories, vaginal inserts, etc., etc.? They already exist. They're widely available south of the border, and they're also available here in BC. So what stage will Health Canada take those on?
So I can tell you all of those things, the nasal sprays, the suppositories, all of those things are included in the new classes that are now legal. So the intention was with this kind of round two of cannabis products was to basically cover the full diversity of products that you see on the black market. And the rationale is precisely for what you said. It's what the expert task force kind of recommended, is provide legal access to the same types of products that you see in the black market so that the legal market can outcompete it, but make sure that the regulatory controls are in place to address the specific risks. So we'll provide access to edible cannabis for sure, and we'll provide access to gummies, but we're not going to provide legal access to gummy bears or any other edible cannabis that can be mistaken by kids as children's candy or as that appealing to kids. So that in that extracts class, I talked about how diverse it is. It includes all of those things. I would say that I kind of reflected on what's happened in the last year. One of the things I said at the substance use conference that I spoke at on Monday was that one of the things that in the past year, what's changed and what hasn't changed, what hasn't changed is kind of patterns of use. So the surveys that Health Canada has carried out and Statistics Canada in terms of prevalence, who's consuming cannabis, how often, since the Cannabis Act came into force, we haven't seen big changes in that. There's been some little blips among certain kind of age groups, but fundamentally, those patterns have not yet changed. We're only 1 year in, it's very early days, so it's too early to draw conclusions. One of the stated objectives is to reduce youth use, so we'll have to be patient and wait and see whether we're actually accomplishing that. But one of the things that has changed and what the evidence does show is obviously the legal market exists now. There are literally hundreds of federally licensed producers. There are around 600 or 700 legal retail stores across the country. And what the research from Statistics Canada shows is that is having an effect. So in the latest results of the National Cannabis Survey, for the first time, the number of cannabis users who are reporting having purchased their cannabis at a legal source went over 50%. And the number of cannabis users reporting having purchased some of their cannabis from an illegal source dropped below 50%. So again, it's very early days. It's too early to kind of declare mission accomplished for sure, but that is a positive sign. And when we look at experience in other jurisdictions like Colorado, Colorado basically estimated that they arrived at around 70% market capture, the legal market capturing around 70% of the total cannabis market after about 4 years. So if that's any sort of benchmark, I think that's kind of the trajectory that we would hope to see in Canada.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, John. Chris Sinclair from Opaskwayak. Recognizing that the First Nations framework is ongoing right now, you got Health Canada, and I'm glad you said what you said this morning, that it's supposed to work in cooperation with other jurisdictions, if you will. But recognizing that there's First Nations on the legal side and there's some in the gray area, and this is where the obstacle comes into place, is the provincial or territorial jurisdictions that are trying to control that market and leave the First Nations out. Is that table being discussed with Health Canada, with the provincial jurisdictions, whereas the First Nations that are coming in? And why I ask that question is because, while we're trying to figure that out, the opportunities are dwindling for First Nations to get in on those markets before they become saturated. So in the case of using me as an example, if I was to get in there and partner with a company that does seeds or retail, to be able to do that and buy product from someone that already has a product that has the integrity to meet or exceed those requirements from Health Canada, how do you address that so that we're not left out until we get the green light and we're in your queue and we're waiting months and months, or if not a year plus, to get approval? How do you be able to fast track that, meeting your requirement? Because if we're successful on the First Nation framework side, our goal is to get that in place by April 1st, 2020.
Yeah, so the approach that we've been taking really up until, and continuing now, is that it's kind of a process of kind of meeting individually with specific communities and specific around specific projects. So we kind of work with the community and its leadership, with the province or territory in question, and try and arrive at kind of an understanding of how to apply the framework, what flexibility exists, what are the particular kind of issues at play in the community, and how best can we kind of manage them and apply our frameworks in a way that achieves our objectives. So that's the approach that we've been taking thus far, is to kind of work within the frameworks as they exist, work with the Cannabis Act, work with provincial and territorial legislation, work with whatever laws exist in the community, and what the specifics are. Are we talking about, is it an application to Health Canada for a cultivation license or a processing license, and making sure that the resources that are there, whether it be the navigator service, making sure that the application is complete and it can be fast tracked to the extent that it's complete and the requirements are demonstrated and we check it off, it can go relatively quickly. But if the issue is more around the retail side, then obviously the provinces and territories need to be involved in that side of the conversation. That's the approach we've been taking so far. So if you want to kind of talk about the specific circumstances that you're facing, then by all means, come grab me after. I'll give you my card and we'll put you in touch with my team.
I do want to raise one example of that, and that's the Muscowpeting First Nation in Saskatchewan, where they've set up their own retail under their own First Nation law, but they're buying product from a gray area, but they do their own testing and it meets or exceeds your standards. But because it's those providers of that cannabis are not legally licensed per se,
Right.
but they do their testing and they meet your requirements.
So, I mean, this is, I guess
Go ahead and clap.
Go ahead and clap. So I guess it's my duty as a public servant, right, to know that we've put in place a pretty comprehensive framework that kind of considers all the different risks that I talked about. And part of that is the ability to verify compliance and to go in and make sure that the tests were conducted appropriately, that the records are right. Obviously, there are people in any industry that are, and we've seen it in the cannabis industry, among the regulated community, that there are those who are willing to push on the rules, to put it politely. So we have, as a public servant, I know I've not only put the rules in place, but there's a way to verify compliance with them. As I talked about, when we get to these new product classes, the risks compound themselves. And so having those frameworks in place to not only set the rules, but to make sure that they're being followed, become even more important. I think that the fact that people are being poisoned and dying from consuming illegally produced, unlicensed cannabis vaping products is a cautionary tale for all of us, that we cannot, I'm sure if you asked the suppliers of dank vapes to those illegal dispensaries in Wisconsin, they were saying, no, man, my product is good, it's safe. But there was no way to verify that and to make sure it's true. So I think that that's the type of, we want to make sure, because I think, as we heard this morning, it's in everyone's interest to make sure that if the producer is producing according to the standards that are required, then there should be an opportunity for them to come in and obtain the proper license so that they're subject to that continued kind of monitoring and evaluation. They should be able to do that. And their products should be then available for sale, not only in Muscatine, but through the entire legal supply chain.
Thank you.
Hello. I have a question for you. My name is Ellen Warner, and I'm not a Native person. I'm a Secretary-Treasurer of the Kootenay United Cannabis Association, so I represent or help to represent several people in the Kootenays who are craft growers and have been craft growers for a long time. And I would just like to talk very briefly about the fact that medicinal dispensaries and compassion clubs across the province are being shut down. Those were the only places where people could get medicine. The laws that you put in place have put in a 10 milligram maximum. And for myself, you know, I need maybe 60 or 70 milligrams of cannabis in order to treat my conditions. It is totally insufficient. You've shut down the quasi-legal access that we've had without any transition plan in place to help those people who still need those products. They need them now. And this is a really, really bad, as a Canadian citizen, I'm totally disappointed that you have withdrawn help from people who are in desperate need for some solution. Cannabis mainly helps neurological problems in a unique way. And you need to start educating people. You need to bring in Dr. Ethan Russo and other people of that caliber to talk about how it affects the neurological system and it can treat things like Huntington's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, ADHD, all sorts of things that are just endemic among our population. You've taken away their access to medicinal cannabis without any transition plan in place. What is the plan? How do we get that access back? I am a medicinal grower. I grow for myself. The traditional market, which has been supplanted by big growers, they're not interested in supplying the medicinal market, or do not appear to be, and there's no effort from the federal government to actually put in place any plan. The provincial government, according to John Conroy, who is the lawyer who's won all our Supreme Court cases for medicinal cannabis, the provincial government has actually no authority whatsoever to regulate for medicinal cannabis. That's not their jurisdiction. So it's yours. So what are you going to do about it? Well, how do we get access and get medicine back to people?
So thanks for the question. I guess I'll kind of make sure I point out a couple of things. The first is you talked about the 10 milligram THC limit. So folks know, under the regulations, there's a limit on how much THC that can be in a container of edible cannabis. So brownie, candy, or beverages. And it's 10 milligrams per container. Ma'am, I wrote the regulations with all due respect. The limit for the extracts class is 1,000 milligrams. So the maximum amount of THC that can be in a container of an extract, such as a capsule or a pill, is 1,000 milligrams. And there's a 10 milligram limit if it's in dosage form. So if it is a capsule or a tablet, each capsule or tablet can have a maximum of 10 milligrams, but you can have a total of 1,000 milligrams in the container. If it's in a non-dosage form, such as in a tincture or something like that, then it's only if it's kind of in a liquid thing, then it has to have a dispensing device that would dispense no more than 10 milligrams per kind of activation. And again, the reason why is I talked about the risks of accidental or overconsumption and protection of youth. So the trade-off was with edible cannabis, you can make it delicious, you can add chocolate, you can add sugar and things like that, which inherently, if a child were to come across it and they would take a bite, they would probably eat the whole thing. So by creating that 10 milligram limit, if that circumstance were to arise, a child ingesting that brownie would have an unpleasant experience, I imagine, but wouldn't end up in the emergency room. With the extracts class, you can't add sugar, you can't make them delicious and things like that, but you can provide it in an inhalable form, such as a vape. You can provide it in very high potency products, such as shatter or wax. You can provide it in the form of a suppository, a nasal spray, a tincture, all of those things. And again, the limit is 10 milligrams per unit, but 1,000 milligrams in the container. And I can show you that part of the rules.
Children, at the last AFM conference that I attended in August, beginning of September, there was a doctor there who spoke to the use of cannabis for treating Dravet syndrome, which is epilepsy. She said that a normal dose might be 2,500 milligrams. Now, can you imagine giving a child 250 capsules? Hello?
So
It's just crazy. And that's typical. It's not a good application. You need to talk to people who are actually using it.
So the other part you talked about is just the legal access framework in general. And I guess I would kind of say two things. Really, when the Cannabis Act came into force, fundamentally, the framework for access to cannabis for medical purposes did not change. The same framework that existed prior to the Cannabis Act remains in place now. So essentially, that framework in summary is that with the support of a healthcare practitioner, an individual can register with a federally licensed seller of cannabis for medical purposes, order online, have it delivered to their home, or as in your case, you can register with Health Canada to produce cannabis for your own medical purposes or designate someone to produce it on your behalf. I think the physical stores in BC that you talked about, the dispensaries and the compassion clubs, were never part of the federal framework for access to cannabis for medical purposes. No, I understand that. But they use them outside of the legal framework the same way that they would continue to use them outside of the legal framework today. There are folks from the BC government who are appearing later today, and I know that there are discussions around transitioning compassion clubs and so on, and kind of dispensaries that have existed in BC from that unregulated space and transitioning them to the legal market.
Hi, Gina Deer. I wanted to point out what was talked about here, the provinces and the lack of, I guess, commitment to working with Indigenous communities on distribution, retail, and things like that. In Quebec, we have that same issue, and we're trying to work parallel and have, common ground, and it hasn't been easy. I'm not sure if it's about them really wanting to keep us out of the market, but they're so busy trying to prepare themselves for this new industry that we're getting left behind again. As Indigenous communities, you hear people are ready to roll, they're ready to do things, right? They want to be in the industry. But the provinces are holding them back, and now they're taking different routes to do different things. The federal government is the one that has the fiduciary responsibility to Indigenous people. So we shouldn't have to go to the provinces. I know you've allotted that responsibility for the retail to the province. But when it comes to First Nations communities, That's when you need to talk about that carve-out that we always hear. It's always mentioned. Because we don't want to have to go alternative routes to get into the business. And that's what's happening. I've heard that here today, and I'm hearing it in other areas. So I think something needs to be done at the federal level to ensure that either the provinces start moving with Indigenous communities or the federal government does something in the way of a carve-out.
So I would say two things before I get the hook here. I would say that, okay, so the two things I would say is that kind of, I'm just looking where you went there, okay, is that you have a willing partner in the federal government in making sure that the application of Canada's cannabis control framework, that it is applied in First Nation communities and all Indigenous communities in a way that meets kind of our shared objectives. And so, absolutely, Health Canada is an ally in any discussion. And I think that we will continue to kind of make sure that we are engaging and are available to engage to talk about how the framework, all of it, is applied in a way that meets the interests of both the federal government and individual communities. The other thing that I would say at the risk of well, I have to say, and I go back to kind of, I guess, appealing that I'm a public servant. And so I'm not the leadership. And I think, you know, Chief McLeod talked about it. I know that individual communities have had political level discussions as well, that those discussions have to take place. So, and kind of my job and the job of my team is to make sure that I'm meeting with communities like yours to understand what your interests are, what kind of the main obstacles are, so that when I brief up and provide my advice to my political bosses, that I'm accurately reflecting what's going on the ground there. And so I've heard the same message that you've just talked about. My team has heard it. It is something that as we prepare to brief, tomorrow's the first day we'll be briefing the Minister of Health on cannabis. It's this type of information that we have that then we provide from us. But at the same time, and I know I've mentioned this to Isidore tons of times, the message has to come in at the political level as well.
Yeah, great.
All right?
That's good, John. So I want to answer to that as well, and just assure you that I think what John is trying to say in a very careful way, that, you know, the bureaucrats can't do political speak. And, you know, what we heard here from Chief McLeod earlier today was the fact that there is the political horsepower and defined set of objectives on where this needs to go. What we've been doing, you know, for probably about 6 months now, is we have been working through the previous Minister Bill Blair and ensuring that particular discussion gets tabled. The AFN is now moving on getting the political push behind this, and we're, I think, at a pretty good place right now, given the fact that this new minister, as John had indicated, has got a lot of sensitivities towards the Indigenous community, understands issues of poverty, understands health and issues of harm reduction. Those things are going to get addressed, but I think what I heard here today was that, you know, as long as we're working towards in a parallel way to ensure that, you know, we do our due diligence and that we, you know, put the regulatory efforts in place and the framework and the systems, and if we're in line with C45 and its objectives, you know, the laws that will apply in our communities will be our laws. And, you know, that's going to be a little bit more of a work in progress, but I think we're seeing now that more and more that First Nations are now coming to the surface and being recognized as more of a formal part of Canada's cannabis industry. And the sooner that we get those issues resolved through legislation, then it's going to become much more normalized. In the meantime, we're working from a policy framework perspective and recognizing that we need to stick as close as we can with the federal government and continuing to remind them that while that world continues to evolve in the mainstream, that First Nations continue to do that work, and we remain committed, and as many communities like Ganawage, like Akwesasne, like Six Nations, other communities around the province and across the country will continue to push that agenda in a way that recognizes the rights and jurisdiction in our communities. So with that, again, thank you, John. It is lunchtime, but let's give John a round of applause. I think he did a really good job. Thank you, John.